This morning, the text that we are focusing on is Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 to 18. Philippians 1, verses 12 to 18. If you want to turn there, I have it up here on the screen. And as I was approaching this passage, I noticed this passage has a great application on politics. And so this morning I'm going to touch on politics, but not in the way that you might think I'm going to. So let's read the passage, Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 to 18. Paul writes this from prison. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice, yes, and I will rejoice. That's our passage this morning, and you might be wondering, how does this apply to politics? Well, this morning I'm not talking about U.S. politics. I'm not talking about the kind of politics that you read in the news. So if you talk about, defining politics, it's the art or science of government, the art or science concerned with guiding or influencing governmental policy, the art or science concerned with winning and holding over control over a government. That's not the definitions I'm using this morning. The definition of politics that I'm using is competition between competing interest groups or individuals for power and leadership, as you would see in a government. The exercise of power and influence within human relationships, organizations, or community used to shape decisions, control resources, or guide behavior, often through negotiation, persuasion, alliances, or strategic positioning. Because you've probably heard the phrase, office politics. These are these power dynamics, right? The differing sources of influence. They're different yet fluid levels of power for making decisions in these interpersonal relationships. It's relational. It's between people. It's strategic. It concerns the values and the maneuvering, right? It's persuasive. It's not always about authority and brute force. Sometimes it's about persuading people. It's distributed. It happens wherever people interact. And this morning, you may have also heard the phrase, and it's kind of our focus, is church politics. This morning, when I say the word politics, I'm not talking about government. I'm not always talking about people being dishonest or having ulterior motives. I'm talking about the art or science of influence. And maybe that's the better word that we're talking about this morning, is influence. How you use your influence. When you see differing agendas with differing influence, and whether you realize it or not, you have influence. As Christians, I think we need to be aware of our influence and conscious of how we influence people. And there's one book of the New Testament that always comes to my mind when we start talking about church politics. That's the book of 3 John. I encourage you to read it this week. It's only 1 page long. It's a very short, I think it's one of the shortest. I don't think it's the shortest, but it's one of the shortest books of our New Testament. And it centers around two people. The Apostle John writes to this gentleman named Gaius. Gaius has been serving the Lord by welcoming fellow Christians as they travel through the town. He welcomes them into his home. He feeds them with meals. He gives them what they need and sends them on their way. So if you have some sort of missionary who's coming to the town, but his agenda is to go farther, but they need a place to stay, well, he'll welcome him into their home. And it seems like he's so open about his home and welcome to treating people well who are serving the Lord. But John writes to Gaius about this other gentleman. His name is Diotrephes. This gentleman, Diotrephes, John says, he likes to put himself first. He does not accept the apostles' authority. He's talking, depending on your translation, one translation said he's talking wicked nonsense. He's making these malicious accusations against the apostle. This guy refuses to welcome certain people into the church and stops people from welcoming these traveling missionaries coming through the town. And so from the letter, it really sounds like Gaius wants to welcome in these traveling missionaries. And as they stop in the town, whether they're going to be in the town for a little bit and do some preaching, or whether they're just going to stop here and then be on their merry way, it sounds like Diotrephes is trying to stop this. He doesn't trust these people. He's stopping people from helping them, and he's putting them out of the church. He's not welcoming them in the church. John writes to Gaius, telling him, this one gentleman, his name is Demetrius, he says, welcome this person. I trust this person. And John says, when I get there, I'm going to straighten Diotrephes out. And so when John says that, you should be afraid. And 3 John really goes perfectly with our text today. Because you have these two people who want to serve God. And they have a great amount of influence in their church. But only one wants to serve God truly. And the other is only serving God for the power. You see, the church is supposed to be filled with people who are honest-hearted. The church is supposed to be filled with people whose only concern is God. But if you've spent more than 5 minutes in a church, you know that's not always the case. Because, well, one, we're all sinners who struggle with sin. And 2, there are people who claim faith who have impure hearts, impure motivations, selfish concerns. And so when we come to this text in Philippians, that's kind of what we're talking about with Paul. Paul is talking about these people who have impure motives. They're doing the right things in this instance, but they do it with impure motives. Look again what he says. He says, some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others do it out of goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. Now, when you read that the first time, it's kind of almost curious. It's like, what is Paul talking about here? Why would people be preaching the gospel from envy and rivalry? They're preaching the gospel knowing that Paul is there for the defense of the gospel, right? But these other guys, Paul, they know that Paul's in prison. They're preaching the gospel out of selfish ambition, not sincerely. They're preaching the gospel trying to afflict Paul while he's in prison. And so from this passage, I'll tell you what I think is going on. This is what it sounds like to me. When Paul was put in prison, I think some of these other preachers thought this is their shot. This is their chance to get some notoriety. Because Paul he's the big name preacher. He's the household name. He's the preacher that everyone knows, right? He's the guy, right? You go to a town and it's got Christians in it. You say, hey, do you know that guy named Paul from Tarsus? They're like, yeah, we know Paul. Or no, we don't know him, but I've read his letters, Paul's the big name, right? He's the household name for Christians. And now he's in prison. Maybe some of the other preachers think to themselves, I'd love to be a big name. I'd love for everyone to know me. I want to be the guy to start all these churches. I want to be the guy to write all these letters. Well, Paul's out of the spotlight. Now it's my chance. I'm going to make a name for myself. Sometimes we get caught thinking that just because someone's doing good things, they must have a good heart. And I wish that was the case, but it's not. You probably know the classic examples of the preachers on TV who have 5 homes, 5 mansions, and a big private jet. Personally, I know preachers that have given me the impression, unfortunately, and I'm not saying for certain, but they've given me the impression by the things that they've said to me that it sounds like they don't really love what they do. They don't really love the people that they're preaching to. And I've known elders, and I've sat in elders' meetings where the people seem more interested in power and being in charge than the people that they're leading. I've seen men and women in churches who have demanded their way to be done in church, and it just gives off the impression. And again, I can't read minds, I can't read hearts, I don't know 100%, but if I'm just judging it by the fruits, it seems like they're more concerned about what they want rather than what's good for the Lord. And I thank God that this church is not that way, and we have honest-hearted leaders and members here, praise God. But this is the concept of influence, right? How you use your influence. Whether you realize it or not, you have influence. And so are you going to use your influence selfishly? Are you going to use your influence to try to get what you want? Or are you going to use your influence to get what the Lord wants? I worked at this one church. I had a widow who was just a wonderful servant. And she didn't speak up too much. She rarely spoke up. But when she did, everyone seemed to listen. And I kind of asked the preacher why. I was their youth minister, and I said, hey, everyone agreed that we were doing this one thing, and when she spoke up, everyone changed their mind. What happened? And he said, well, she was an elementary school teacher her whole life, and she's taught Sunday morning Bible class her entire life, never taking a break. And all these deacons and most of these elders had her as a teacher as children and respected her input that much. She had a whole lot of influence, and praise God, she used it for good reasons. But I knew one church member that left another church to come to the church I was working at. And I was just talking to her, asking her, I was glad to have her in the church, but I was wondering what caused you to switch churches. And she told me that in her previous church, there was this Bible class teacher. And he was a good teacher, but he was teaching things that was just blatantly incorrect from the Bible. And she brought this up, and he didn't change his mind. She brought it to the elders, and the elders said, yeah, you're right. He's not teaching what's right, but the thing is, he gives a lot of money. Oof. And so they said, we're just going to let it be. And she heard that, and she switched churches, which in that instance, probably the right choice. So those elders had a lot of influence, and they used it in an ungodly way. That Bible teacher had a lot of influence just from the money. He really shouldn't have had that much influence from the money. You ignore the money when it comes to God's way, right? I've sat in elders' meetings, and I've watched power struggles. And I'm not saying they're always dishonest, but whenever you got an elders meeting and there's this big decision and half of them think this way and the other half think this way, you got a power struggle. I mean, whether they're being honest or dishonest, right? And we don't like to think it in those terms. That's why I'm trying to use the term influence rather than just church politics. But I knew one elder. He was probably the most active elder I've ever seen. Kind, loving people. If you were in the hospital, he was right there. But as I got to know him, he loved to be in charge. He always wanted to be in charge. And the other elders kind of let him do as he saw fit. The whole church was kind of unaware of this for the longest time. This one elder kind of ran the show. He did so much for the church, but the problem was, anytime you disagreed with him or crossed him, he would never forgive you, and he would try to make sure you never got in charge of anything ever again. He had so much influence because of all the work he did for the Lord, but he didn't use it in a godly way. And I'm sure, you probably understand how this works when it comes to office politics or even in your family or wherever you live. We see this all the time, just the difference of agendas, and the different levels of power. Maybe you've worked in an office where it's like, yeah, that's the boss. That other guy, he's the best friend of the boss, so he's got a lot of power. This other guy shouldn't have that much power, but he's the boss's son, so he's got plenty of power, You want to be on good terms with these people. You know how it goes. It's important to understand that these people who have a lot of influence, from like that letter in 3 John, there was Gaius who used his influence for really good things, serving the Lord. And there was Diotrephes who used his influence to try to control things. And the more I've been in churches and the more I've been around people, the more I've realized it's a very thin line between the two. We think they're worlds apart, but this is what Jesus talked about wolves in sheep's clothing. There are people who seem honest-hearted, but are anything but. And the opposite can be true, too. When you think someone's completely dishonest, but you don't know the heart, and they turn out to be completely honest. We got to have some humility and understand we might be mistaken. All we can do is just judge fruit, judge what they do, what they say. And so when we look at what Paul's trying to say, whenever Paul is addressing these people who are doing the right thing for the wrong reason, Paul, he's in a bad situation. He's in prison. And there are people with bad intentions trying to get at him. And yet, in this passage, he still has joy. And I think he has joy because he knows what the most important thing is. The most important thing is proclaiming the gospel. I think his central point right here, the most important thing is the gospel being proclaimed, even in bad situations or with people with bad intentions. So I'm going to read the passage again, and I want us to focus on that idea, that the most important thing is the gospel, whether you're in a bad situation or with people who have bad intentions. Paul's in prison. That's a bad situation. There are people preaching out of selfish ambition. There are people with bad intentions. And Paul doesn't care about these things. The thing he cares about is that people are learning about Jesus. Let's read the passage again. He says, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I'm put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Yes, and I will rejoice. Paul's attitude, I think this passage is summed up very well in verse 18, right? This last slide right here. He says, what? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, whether with sincerity or with an agenda, Christ is proclaimed. If Christ is proclaimed, I'm going to rejoice. That's the heart of this passage. I don't care where I am. I'm in prison. I don't care if there are people that are rivals trying to get at me. Whether he was in a good mood or not really depended upon people learning that Jesus died for our sins and conquered death. That's where his heart is. Is that where your heart is? See, Paul was able to have joy in these bad situations. Why? Because he looked on the bright side of things. And when I say look on the bright side of things, I'm talking about looking at God's side of things. The bright side of things is God. He was in prison. He was chained to a soldier 24 hours a day in 6-hour shifts. He has a chain around his ankle. Every time he moved, he felt that chain tugging. He could not leave the house he was in. But he looked at God's side of things. Even if he was in prison, people are learning about the gospel. Every 6 hours, he gets a new soldier, right? And I mean, he gets a captive audience. Those Roman soldiers are hearing him teach, watching him pray. They leave and they tell people what they've heard, and Paul says, the whole imperial guard knows about this guy named Paul who's teaching about Jesus who was resurrected. Paul being in prison was an inspiration to people. People have become more confident. If Paul can preach the gospel in prison, then I can preach where I am here right now. If Paul can preach the gospel in prison, then I can preach it to my family. I can preach it to my coworkers at work. I can preach it to my friends out and about, to the people I meet every day. And when it came to Paul's rivals, the people who had bad intentions, the people who were trying to get at him, the people who were doing the right things but for the wrong motives, Paul looked at God's side of things again. They preached the gospel, trying to build up a name for themselves rather than out of service to God or love for people. And Paul shrugged his shoulders and said, well, as long as they're preaching the truth. Paul's not saying it's okay to have impure motives. He's saying, they're not going to get at me. I'll still rejoice. Because at the end of the day, this is a lesson for these office politics, these church politics. Paul didn't care who did it. He just wanted it to be done. Paul didn't care about the spotlight. He just wanted to serve God. And if serving God meant he had to get in the spotlight, that's fine. And if serving God meant he had to get out of the spotlight, that's fine. Paul didn't care about who got the glory except for God. Paul didn't care if some of these preachers became the big name preachers instead of Paul and Paul's reputation diminished. He didn't care about that. Why? Because he wasn't in it for the reputation. He just wanted to get the work done. He doesn't need the fame. He doesn't need the reputation. He doesn't need the power. All he wanted was God glorified, Christ proclaimed, and people saved. We have to make sure that's our motive too. Paul he's maintaining pure motives despite having people around him with impure motives. And if you've ever been in a situation like that, you know that can be very difficult sometimes. Paul kept in mind, I don't need the glory. I want God to have the glory. You're going to find yourself in situations like these. You're going to find yourselves in bad situations like Paul was in prison. You're going to find yourself in situations where you're surrounded by people with bad motives, where you have people in your life who are really just trying to get at you dishonestly. But Paul here, he looked at the bright side of things. He looked at God's side of things. As long as God was glorified, as long as the work got done, as long as Christ is proclaimed, Paul chose to rejoice. I think we all need to be praying for this kind of heart. We need to be praying for this kind of heart so that when you find yourselves in those difficult situations, you ask yourself, is Christ proclaimed? Well, if that's the case, then I'm glad. When you find yourself in those situations where you have someone in your life, maybe a coworker, maybe a family member, maybe, I don't know what's going on in your life. Maybe you just have someone in your life that's really just seems to be getting at you. You ask the question, well, is Christ proclaimed? Well, then I can be glad. Because if we're letting those bad situations get to us, if we're letting the people with bad intentions get to us, then you care too much about it. If the bad situation puts you in a bad mood, you're caring too much about the situation. If people with bad motivations put you in a bad mood, you're caring too much about them. What you need to be caring about is God's will. You need to be caring about whether the work is getting done. You need to be caring about your light shining. You need to care about whether you're able to vocalize that Jesus died for our sins. You need to be caring about something else. You need to be caring about God's work. Paul's focus was on the gospel. He wanted people to learn about Jesus. His situation didn't depress him. Why? Because he was focused on the gospel. He focused on what he could do. He focused on his influence. Rather than letting the situation influence him, rather than letting the people with bad motivations influence him, he was going to influence his situation. He was going to influence them instead. He was going to be a light shining, sharing the gospel. He was going to have joy in a situation that didn't seem like you could have joy. He focused on the mission. He focused on God's people. Think about your influence. Think about your ability to affect people. Do you use your influence to spread the gospel? Do you use your influence so that you can tell people about Jesus? Do you use your influence to show people Jesus with your actions? Do you let your bad situations depress you? Do you let the people in your life frustrate you? You're getting distracted. Because bad situations, people with bad motives, they're always going to be around. I think one of the greatest choices I ever made in my life is I decided I'm not going to care about unreasonable opinions. I just made that choice. If there's an opinion out there and I find out that it's unreasonable, I don't care about it. I hear someone's opinion. I don't dismiss it right away. And I kind of ask myself, is it right? Is it said in sincerity? If it's an unreasonable opinion, it's out of my head and I no longer care about it. Because even if there are people with bad motives trying to get at you, find something positive to focus on. And with God, there's always something positive to focus on. When you let those bad motives change your outlook to ruin your day, that they're influencing you, not the other way around. You show them love. You be kind. You be compassionate. You do something good. If you have to, get away and pray a little bit. Give God the glory. But think in your life. Who do you influence? What about your relationships? Everyone you're close to? Everyone you talk to? Everyone you interact with? You have the power to make someone have a good day, and you have the power to make someone have a bad day, right? That's influence. How do you use your influence? Do you use your influence out of envy and rivalry? Do you use your influence out of selfish ambition, not sincerely? When you talk to people, are you trying to build yourself up? Or, like Paul says, he's using his influence to proclaim Christ. This morning, I want you to consider, how do you use your influence? Are you in one of those situations where you are in a bad situation, right? When you feel like you're frustrated and surrounded by people with bad intentions, and you need to refocus yourself, and you need to look at God's side of things, on the bright side of things, so that you can rejoice. God gave us so many opportunities to rejoice. This morning, that's the question for you. If you have any need, the invitation is going to be for you. Come forward as we stand and sing.